G'day teenagers, and welcome to episode 2 of this edition of Project 15 as we are going through the book of Romans. On today's episode, we're going to be looking at Romans chapter 1, verses 8 to 16. So let's pause the video now, read the passage, and then press play. Well, teenagers, as you've no doubt gathered by now, this particular letter is addressed to a group of Christians who lived at that time in the most populated city in the world, in the city of Rome, the capital of the Roman Empire. As I mentioned last time, there was approximately 1 million people who lived in this city. And even though the Christian population was really small, it was made up of people from different ethnic backgrounds and different socioeconomic backgrounds. And one of the things that Paul says here is he doesn't know the Christians in Rome firsthand, but he longed to get to know them. And this is part of the reason why he wrote this letter. He wanted to introduce himself to the Christians in Rome and tell them how he longed to come and visit them so that they could encourage each other in their relationship with God. Now, one thing which is important to note is that Paul was called an apostle. What was an apostle? The word apostle really just means somebody who was sent by Christ. One of the main things that most of the apostles had in common was they were people who had seen the resurrected Christ. They had seen the risen Christ, and he had commissioned them, he had sent them out to preach the gospel. So Paul was quite an important figure in the New Testament church. In fact, 13 of the books in the New Testament were written by him. And even though he didn't personally know the Christians in Rome, they no doubt knew of him, and they knew about how God had transformed his life, how he went from persecuting the church and hating Christians to becoming a student, a follower of Christ himself. And Paul really encourages this church, and he praises them, and he says, your faith, all of the wonderful things that God has been doing in your life, it is being proclaimed around the world. And the reason why Paul wanted to visit Rome is, as the capital of the Roman Empire, not only were there a lot of people there who needed to hear about Jesus, but Paul could use that city as a springboard to go into other major cities and other major towns and to preach the gospel. But one thing that I just want to highlight is I want you to turn your attention to verse 16. Look at what Paul says. He says, "For I am not ashamed of this good news about Christ. It is the power of God at work, saving everyone who believes, the Jew first and also the Gentile." We know that Jesus was Jewish in ethnicity, and a Gentile was basically anybody who was not Jewish. So what Paul was saying is that this good news, this gospel about the life of Jesus, has the ability to save every person on the planet, regardless of their ethnicity. And Paul says, I'm not ashamed. I'm not ashamed of the gospel message. He's saying, I'm not ashamed to go around telling people about who Jesus is. I'm not ashamed to go around and tell people about how they can have a personal relationship with the living God, how they can put their trust in Jesus because he died for their sins and he came back from the dead. Now, even though, brothers and sisters, the gospel message was good news, there was a temptation in Paul's day for people to be scared, to be afraid to tell other people about Jesus. You see, in the city of Rome itself and throughout the empire, Christians were not well liked. Many of them were persecuted, many of them were arrested, many of them were tortured, many of them were imprisoned, many of them were even killed for their faith. In fact, a few years after Paul writes this letter to the church in Rome, a group of them will be collectively executed in some of the most heinous ways under the order of the emperor Nero. So it was tempting for Christians in Paul's day, especially in Rome, to be scared. It was tempting for people to not want to talk about Jesus because the world around them would have hated them and judged them. And I want to leave you with that as our takeaway today. You know, we should never be ashamed to call ourselves followers of Christ. We should never be ashamed to tell people about Jesus. We should never be ashamed to invite people to church, to invite them to youth group. We should never be afraid or ashamed to tell people that God has died for our sins and that Jesus came back from the dead. So I want to encourage you with that, teenagers. Just like Paul, don't be ashamed to go out into the world and tell people you are a Christian and you follow the living God. God bless you, teenagers, and let's go now into our 7 minutes of prayer. And we'll see you for episode 3.